Imagine a disagreement, a very big one, not just between two people, but between many, many countries all at once. Now imagine that this disagreement doesn't just involve angry words, but involves soldiers and ships, aeroplanes and giant armies, all fighting against each other across the entire globe. This is what we call a world war. It's a time when the whole planet seems to hold its breath, caught up in a terrible and enormous conflict. These were not small, quick battles. They were long, hard struggles that lasted for years and years, touching the lives of nearly everyone, whether they were a soldier on the front line or a child waiting for a loved one to come home safely. There have been two of these immense conflicts in our history, the First World War and the Second World War. They happened a long time ago, before your parents or even your grandparents were born. But their stories are incredibly important. They are like giant, dark storms that swept across the world, changing everything they touched. Learning about them helps us understand the world we live in today, because many of the countries, the rules, and the friendships between nations were shaped by these events. It is like looking at an old map of the world before the storm, and then a new map after it has passed. You can see just how much has been rearranged and altered forever. These wars were called world wars because they truly involved nations from every corner of the earth. From the fields of France to the deserts of Africa, from the vast oceans to the skies above cities, the fighting spread far and wide. It wasn't just soldiers who were involved. Men and women back home worked in factories to build weapons and supplies. Children collected scrap metal, and families grew vegetables in their gardens to help feed the nation. Everyone had a part to play, and everyone felt the impact of the war in their daily lives. It was a time of great courage, but also of great sadness and loss for so many people. Thinking about these wars can feel a bit like listening to a story from a faraway land, a tale of heroes and epic battles, but it is a true story and one that we must listen to carefully. It teaches us about how disagreements can grow so large that they spiral out of control. It shows us the incredible bravery that people can have, but also the terrible things that can happen when peace is lost. By understanding what happened, we can learn important lessons about friendship, about standing up for what is right, and about working together to make sure such a great, global trouble never ever happens again. When the First World War began in 1914, the countries of the world quickly formed two main teams, like in a giant game of tug-of-war. One of these teams was called the Allied Powers, or sometimes the Entente. The main players on this team were Great Britain, France, and Russia. Imagine them as three very large and powerful friends who had made a promise to protect each other if any of them got into trouble. Great Britain had a mighty navy that ruled the seas, and a vast empire of countries around the world, like Canada, Australia, and India, who also joined the fight to help. France shared a long border with its rival Germany and was determined to defend its land. Russia was enormous, with a huge army of soldiers. On the other side of the battlefield was the second team, known as the Central Powers. The most important members of this group were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is now modern-day Turkey. Germany had a very strong, well-trained army and many new industries that could build powerful weapons. It was a proud and ambitious nation that wanted to become even more powerful in Europe. The country of Austria-Hungary was a huge and old empire, made up of many different groups of people, and it was a quarrel with its neighbor, Serbia, that would light the fuse for the entire war. The Ottoman Empire joined their side a little later, adding another front to the conflict in the Middle East. As the war went on for 4 long years, more countries decided to join in, usually picking the side they felt was most likely to win or the one that best protected their own interests. A very important country, the United States of America, stayed out of the fight at first. For 3 years, it watched from across the Atlantic Ocean. But in 1917, it decided to join the Allied powers. The arrival of fresh American soldiers and supplies gave a huge boost to Britain and France, helping to tip the balance of the war. Other countries, like Italy and Japan, also joined the Allies, making their team even bigger and more global in scale. So you had these two massive groups of nations locked in a terrible struggle. The Allied powers, a sprawling alliance that eventually included countries from almost every continent, and the Central Powers, a more compact but very formidable group right in the heart of Europe. The lines were drawn and the world was divided. It was a fight that pulled in millions of people, from farmers to factory workers, all called to serve their country on one of these two great teams. The choices they made and the promises they kept to their allies would decide the fate of the world for many years to come. You might wonder how such a gigantic war could ever start. It wasn't one single thing, but many problems bubbling under the surface for years, like a big pot of soup simmering on a stove. For a long time, the big countries in Europe had been in a competition. They were building up their armies and navies, each trying to have more soldiers and bigger ships than their neighbors. This is called militarism. They were also busy building empires, taking control of lands in Africa and Asia to get more resources and power. This created a lot of jealousy and mistrust between them. It was a time when everyone felt they had to look strong and nobody wanted to back down. Another big part of the problem was a system of alliances, which were those secret promises we talked about. Countries had formed teams, like the Allied powers and the Central Powers, and promised to defend each other. This meant that a small argument between just two countries could quickly pull in all of their friends. It was like a chain reaction. If one country declared war on another, its allies had to jump in and help, and then the other country's allies had to jump in too. Suddenly, a little fire could turn into a massive blaze that spread across the whole continent of Europe. It was a very dangerous setup. The spark that finally lit this powder keg happened in a city called Sarajevo in 1914. A very important man from Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was visiting the city with his wife Sophie. He was the heir to the throne of the empire. A young man from the neighboring country of Serbia, who was unhappy with Austria-Hungary's rule over some of his people, shot and killed the Archduke and his wife. This terrible event made Austria-Hungary furious. It blamed the entire country of Serbia for what had happened and made a list of very harsh demands. Serbia couldn't agree to all of them, and so Austria-Hungary declared war. This was the moment the alliances kicked in. Russia, being a friend to Serbia, started getting its army ready to help. Germany, the ally of Austria-Hungary, saw this and declared war on Russia to protect its friend. Then Germany also declared war on France, because France was Russia's ally. To get to France quickly, the German army marched through a small neutral country called Belgium. This made Great Britain very angry, as it had promised to protect Belgium. So, Britain declared war on Germany. In just a few weeks, a single tragic event had triggered a domino effect, pulling all the great powers of Europe into a terrible, all-consuming war. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1918, the world was a very different place. The war had left deep scars on the land and on the people. Whole towns and villages in countries like France and Belgium were completely destroyed, turned into fields of mud and rubble. An entire generation of young men was lost. Millions of soldiers had died in the fighting, and many more came home with terrible injuries that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Families everywhere were grieving for fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. The world had never seen death and destruction on such a massive scale before, and the sadness was felt in every corner of the globe. The map of Europe was completely redrawn, as if a giant hand had wiped away the old borders and sketched in new ones. The huge empires that had started the war were gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into several smaller countries like Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Ottoman Empire also collapsed, and its lands in the Middle East were divided up. Even Russia had changed dramatically. During the war, a revolution had taken place, and it became the Soviet Union, a new type of country with a completely different government. New nations were born, but this also created new problems and arguments over where the borders should be. The countries that won the war, especially Britain, France, and the United States, met to decide what should happen next. They created a special treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war. This treaty placed all the blame for the war on Germany and its allies. It forced Germany to pay huge sums of money, called reparations, to help repair the damage done to other countries. It also took away Germany's colonies and severely limited the size of its army and navy. Many people in Germany felt that this treaty was incredibly unfair and harsh, planting seeds of anger and resentment that would sadly grow in the years to come. In an effort to prevent such a terrible war from ever happening again, the world's leaders created a new organization called the League of Nations. The idea was for countries to have a place where they could talk through their disagreements peacefully instead of fighting. It was a wonderful and hopeful idea, a promise to work together for a better future. However, the League was not very strong. Some powerful countries, like the United States, never even joined. It struggled to make countries follow its rules, and it could not stop the anger and ambition that were already beginning to bubble up again, leading the world down the path to another, even bigger conflict. Just 20 years after the First World War ended, the world found itself on the brink of another, even more devastating conflict. The teams that formed for the Second World War, which began in 1939, were different from the first. One side was known as the Axis powers. The three main countries on this team were Germany, Italy, and Japan. Germany was now led by a powerful and dangerous dictator named Adolf Hitler, who had rebuilt the German army and wanted to conquer other nations to create a massive German empire. In Italy, another dictator named Benito Mussolini had similar ambitions. And far away in Asia, Japan's military leaders wanted to expand their own empire across the Pacific. On the opposing side were the Allied powers, a mighty group of nations determined to stop the Axis. At the beginning of the war, the main Allied countries in Europe were Great Britain and France, just as they had been in the First War. They stood against Germany's aggression, with Great Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill promising his people that they would never surrender. The British Empire, including countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand and India, once again joined the fight, providing soldiers and resources from all around the world. These nations knew they were facing a terrible threat to freedom and democracy. For a while, two of the world's biggest countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, were not part of the fight against the Axis. The Soviet Union, led by its own dictator Joseph Stalin, had actually signed an agreement with Germany at first. But in 1941, Hitler broke his promise and launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This shocking betrayal immediately made the Soviet Union one of the most important members of the Allied powers, and it began fighting a huge and brutal war against Germany on the Eastern Front. The sheer size of the Soviet army would prove to be crucial in the fight. The United States also tried to stay neutral at the beginning, just as it had in the First World War. But that all changed on a Sunday morning in December 1941. Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This event shocked and angered the American people, and the very next day, the United States declared war on Japan and officially joined the Allied powers. With its massive industrial power and millions of fresh troops, the United States' entry into the war created what was called the Grand Alliance of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the USA, a force strong enough to finally challenge and defeat the Axis powers. The end of the First World War had left many problems unsolved. In Germany, the people felt humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. The requirement to pay huge sums of money had crippled their country and made life very difficult. This widespread anger and desperation made it possible for a powerful and persuasive speaker, Adolf Hitler, to rise to power. He promised to make Germany strong again, to tear up the unfair treaty, and to give the German people back their pride. He built up a massive army, breaking the rules of the treaty, but other countries hoped he would stop and did not do enough to challenge him early on. Hitler and his Nazi party also had hateful and dangerous ideas. They believed that some groups of people were better than others, and they particularly blamed Jewish people for Germany's problems. This hatred would lead to the Holocaust, a terrible and systematic campaign of persecution and murder against millions of innocent Jewish men, women, and children, as well as other groups. Alongside these vile beliefs, Hitler had a grand ambition to conquer more land for Germany, what he called living space, especially in Eastern Europe. He began by taking over neighboring countries like Austria and Czechoslovakia, testing to see if anyone would stop him. The leaders of Britain and France were desperate to avoid another war. They remembered the horrors of the first one and tried a strategy called appeasement. This meant they gave Hitler some of the things he wanted, hoping that he would then be satisfied and that peace could be saved. For example, they allowed him to take over part of Czechoslovakia. However, this strategy did not work. It only made Hitler bolder and more confident, as he believed that the other countries were too weak or scared to fight him. He kept pushing, making more demands and preparing his armies for a much larger conflict. The final straw came in September 1939. After signing a secret pact with the Soviet Union to not fight each other, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. This was a clear act of aggression that could not be ignored. Britain and France had promised to protect Poland, and this time they had to keep their word. They gave Germany a final warning to leave Poland, but Hitler refused. In response, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War began. The policy of appeasement had failed, and the world was once again plunged into a devastating global conflict, all because of the unchecked ambition and hatred of one country's leaders. The Second World War was even more widespread and destructive than the first. It was a total war, meaning that it affected not just soldiers on the battlefield, but civilians in cities and towns far from the fighting. New and terrifying technologies were used. Aeroplanes were used to drop bombs on cities in what was known as the Blitz, forcing families to hide in shelters underground. Millions of ordinary people lost their homes, and entire cities like London, Dresden, and Tokyo were turned into ruins. The war brought fear and hardship into everyday life in a way that had never been experienced before. It was a conflict fought in the skies and on the streets, not just in distant trenches. The human cost of the war was staggering, far greater than anyone could have imagined. It is estimated that over 60 million people died, more than half of them civilians who were not even soldiers. This number includes the approximately 6 million Jewish people who were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, one of the darkest chapters in human history. Millions of soldiers from all sides died in combat, from the frozen plains of Russia to the tropical islands of the Pacific. Every country involved suffered immense losses, and the world was left to mourn a generation and grapple with the scale of the horror that had unfolded. When the war finally ended in 1945, after the defeat of Germany and the dropping of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world was shaken to its core. The use of these new, incredibly powerful atomic weapons showed that humanity now had the ability to destroy itself completely. This created a new kind of fear that would hang over the world for decades to come, a period known as the Cold War. The world was split into two new teams, one led by the Democratic United States and the other by the Communist Soviet Union. They were former allies who were now deep rivals, and their tense relationship would shape global events for the next 45 years. The balance of power in the world shifted dramatically. The great European empires of Britain and France were exhausted and weakened by the war. They could no longer afford to maintain their vast colonies around the globe. In the years that followed, many countries in Africa and Asia that had been ruled by Europeans demanded and won their independence. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as the two new superpowers, the most powerful and influential nations on Earth. The old world order was gone, and a new, more uncertain one had taken its place, forever changed by 6 years of terrible conflict. After the devastation of 2 world wars, people everywhere were determined to build a better, safer, and more peaceful world. They knew they could not let such a catastrophe happen for a third time. One of the most important steps they took was to create a new international organization to replace the failed League of Nations. In 1945, leaders from 50 countries met and founded the United Nations. Its main purpose was, and still is, to maintain international peace and security, to encourage friendship among nations, and to help countries work together to solve economic, social, and humanitarian problems. The United Nations became a place for dialogue, a forum where countries could talk instead of fight. Countries in Europe, which had been the battlefield for both wars, realized they needed to cooperate more closely to prevent future conflicts. This led to the beginning of what would eventually become the European Union. The idea was simple but powerful. If countries traded with each other and shared resources like coal and steel, their economies would become so linked that going to war against each other would be unthinkable. Old enemies like France and Germany began to work together as partners. This spirit of cooperation helped to rebuild the continent from the ruins of war and has maintained peace in Western Europe for over 70 years. The wars also brought about big changes in society. Women had played a vital role on the home front, working in factories, on farms, and in other jobs that had previously been done only by men. This showed everyone what women were capable of, and it helped to strengthen the movement for women's rights and equality. In many countries, the shared experience of the war also led to a greater sense of community and a desire for a fairer society. Governments began to create new social programs, like public healthcare systems and better support for the unemployed and elderly, to take better care of all their citizens. However, the world was not entirely at peace. The deep mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War, created a new kind of tension. The world was divided by an iron curtain between the democratic West and the communist East. Both sides built up huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and for decades people lived with the fear of a nuclear war that could destroy the planet. While a direct war between the two superpowers was avoided, they competed for influence all over the world, sometimes supporting opposite sides in other smaller wars. It was a long and anxious period of peace that was always overshadowed by the threat of a much greater conflict. It can be difficult to think about the world wars. The stories are filled with so much sadness and loss, but it is so important that we do not forget them. Remembering is not about celebrating war. It is about honoring the memory of the millions of people who lived through those terrible times, the soldiers who fought with incredible bravery, and the ordinary families who endured so much. By learning their stories, we keep their memory alive. We build monuments, we hold moments of silence, and we wear poppies to remember the sacrifices they made so that we could live in freedom and peace. It is our duty to remember them. Learning about the causes of these wars is like learning a very important lesson from history. We see how things like extreme nationalism, where people think their country is better than all others, can be so dangerous. We see how mistrust, fear, and a failure to talk to one another can lead to disaster. These wars teach us that disagreements between countries are normal, but that there are better ways to solve them than through fighting. Understanding the mistakes of the past helps us to not repeat them in the future. It gives us the wisdom to choose a different path, a path of understanding and respect. The stories of the wars also show us the very best of human spirit. In the darkest of times, there were countless acts of courage, kindness, and friendship. Soldiers looked after their comrades, neighbors helped each other after bombing raids, and brave individuals risked their own lives to hide and save people from persecution. These stories remind us that even when things seem at their worst, the power of human goodness can shine through. They teach us about resilience, about the importance of standing together, and about fighting for the values we believe in, like freedom, fairness, and compassion for others. Ultimately, studying the world wars teaches us the true value of peace. Peace is not just the absence of war. It is something we must actively build and protect every single day. It is built when we listen to people who are different from us, when we try to understand their point of view, and when we treat everyone with kindness and respect. It is built when countries work together to solve problems like poverty and climate change. The world wars were a painful reminder that peace is precious and fragile. By remembering the past, we learn to cherish the peace we have and to work hard to ensure that all future generations can grow up in a world without such great and terrible wars.